Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. And he has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. And because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide us to the path of peace. These are the words in Luke chapter 1. This is right before we get into Luke chapter 2, which many of us are familiar with. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world, and the rest of the Charlie Brown Christmas story. But this is the very tail end of that, and as Luke is starting to share, this is the story that ends. This is the way that Luke chapter 1 ends. And if we really think about it, there's a lot of ways that we can look at, but we can look at the ways that things end, but one of my favorite is by looking at the ends of movies. Have you guys ever looked at the end of a movie? Listen to the end of a movie, the last words. How about this one? Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, you guys know it. Oh my goodness, that's such a classic way to end a film. Oh, for those of you who like the movie, I know there's some people out there who aren't a fan of It's a Wonderful Life. But man, if you got to watch George Bailey go through all of the stuff that he went through, these words, while they can be touching, man, especially if you resonate, or if you see your life, or if you see something through his life, these words mean so much more, right? They mean so much more. Well, the closing of chapter 1 is no different from this, and throughout this fantastic story that we're going to be taking part in, that we're going to be learning from, this Christmas story that Luke gives us, it kicks off the birth of the Messiah. And just like these classic films, it's hard to really appreciate it unless we get to look at things from a different point of view. The things that unfold, the things that they were actually going through. So right now, what we're going to do for the next few weeks as we lead up to Christmas is ask the infamous Christmas question, do you see what I see? And as we start looking at these characters that are in place during the Christmas story, what can we learn from going through and seeing the birth, seeing the gift that God gave us, seeing Emmanuel, God with us, from somebody else's viewpoint? The passage that I started off reading was Zechariah. This is a character that a lot of people don't think about when they think of a Christmas story or one of the Christmas characters, but Zechariah was the father of John the Baptist, who Tiffany read about a little bit today. The person that was coming to proclaim who the Messiah was. So let's start out and see what's on the back of Zechariah's Pokemon card, right? What are the attributes that kind of lead up to who Zechariah is? What are the things that are going through? And in Luke chapter 1, verse 5 is where we start to see this story unfold. And Luke gives us some very good characteristics about this man. And the first one is that he was a priest. In Luke chapter 1, verse 5, there was a Jewish man named Zechariah who was a member of the priestly order of Abijah. And his wife Elizabeth was also from the priestly line of Aaron. So we know he was a priest. In those days, religious workers were divided into two groups. There were the Levites and the priests. And all the descendants from the tribe of Levi, but additionally, the priests were descendants of Moses' brother Aaron. Same Aaron that helped Moses free God's people, right? They were set apart for a unique ministry within the temple concerning the worship of God. And so Zechariah is a priest, and he's got the lineage to prove it. And he married an awesome lady by the name of Elizabeth. She was also from the priestly line. You didn't have to do that. He just got lucky, I guess. But her lineage could be directly traced back to Aaron. She got clout, right? And they wanted us to know this. And just like we have a lot of Christmas traditions and symbolism in our Christmas traditions, the same could be said about the Israelite people when it came to their priestly customs. In 1 Chronicles chapter 24, it kind of lays out what a lot of these priestly duties were. and that they were divided up into 24 groups, and each year these groups would get to serve 2 times a year for a week long. And when they were serving, there would be a high priest chosen to take into the Holy of Holy Places. This is the representation of God right here on earth. This is the presence of God. He'd be taken into this, and he would take some incense, and as he burned it, it would symbolize all of the prayers of his people rising up to heaven, rising up to God. He's offering the prayers of the people on himself. And he would go in and he would fall face down and humble himself before God. And as he would come out, he would give a priestly blessing to the people. While he was in there, all the people would pray this prayer, and they say, may the merciful God enter the holy place and accept with favor the offering of his people. Right? Everyone would be praying, and then whenever the officiating high priest would come out, he would offer a blessing to the people. Now, I said there were 24 groups that were there, so they only served 2 times a year. They would be on for a week, but there was anywhere between 50 and 350 priests that they would cast lots and decide who is the officiating priest for the day that gets to go in and offer these prayers to God. So he wanted us to know a little bit about that. He also wanted us to know one more thing, that he wasn't just a priest, but that him and his wife were righteous. In Luke chapter 1, verse 6, it says, Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous in God's eyes. They were careful to obey all of the Lord's commands and regulations. This is something that throughout history, a lot of people have understood that there were a lot of people that weren't doing that, right? There was a lot of people that weren't doing that, but he wanted each of his readers to know that they backed up their outward compliance with the inward obedience. That when they said and when they meant something, they didn't just do it for everybody else, for the outward compliance. They genuinely meant it, and they were righteous. These are the same words that were spoken about people like Noah and Job, that they were righteous before God. Man, what a compliment that they would have. And it was important that Luke tells us this, that not only were they priests, not only were they righteous, but they were righteous because the next words out of written down were something that a lot of people had an issue with. They had no children because Elizabeth was unable to conceive, and they were both very old. They had a personal problem, this couple. They couldn't conceive, and in those days it wasn't just frowned upon or looked down upon. Many people thought that this was because of some area of your life that you had not surrendered over to God, some poison that is still left in your life that God wasn't blessing you with this. And it was a pain point for this couple throughout their life. It was not just a pain point, it was a rather public one. Everyone knew that they didn't have kids, and you could see it within the community. And I think we all have pain points like that, right? We all have pain points that we don't want people to bring up whenever it comes to the family reunion. When it comes to getting together for Christmas, there are those things in our life where we're like, let's just not talk about that. And year after year, you just have to constantly keep answering the question. And they had done this to the point that they were very old. To it, one passage says, it translates, they were stricken with old age, right? Put that on a Hallmark card and send it out as a birthday present. Right? Stricken with old age. My goodness. But as he continues, now that we kind of have our attribute list, right? That he was a priest, that he was righteous, that they were barren and they were old, Luke gets into the story portion of Luke chapter 1 of this couple. One day as Zechariah was serving God in the temple, for his order was on duty that week, as was the custom of the priests, we talked about that, he was chosen by lot to enter the sanctuary of the Lord's house to burn incense. Now, I told you that there was anywhere between 50 to 350 priests that were up for this job. Imagine putting 50 to 350 lots, rocks, whatever it is, names into a bucket and spilling one out. This was a rare opportunity. Some scholars even believe that especially during this time when there were so many priests, that this was a once in a lifetime opportunity where you got to go and be the officiating high priest. It was the jury duty moment, if everyone loved to sign up for jury duty, right? I think most people now try to get out of it. This wasn't Zechariah's case. He wanted to. This was an honor beyond all honors, and he finally got to do it in his old age. And following this honor, I can only imagine the realization that sat upon Zechariah in this moment. Taking everything in, the fact that this was probably his last time ever being able to enter the Holy of Holy Places, even if he had done it when he was younger. As he looked into the future and saw his old age and saw his wife, and they were out head tombstone shopping, or just kind of getting their affairs in order, it would have been easy for Zechariah to sit in that moment and just be like, all right, now it's time to ride off into the sunset. What a way to go. And then he goes in, something happens. Do not be afraid, Zechariah. An angel of the Lord appeared to him. He walks into the Holy of Holy Places. He walks into God's presence here on earth. He walks in, and an angel is there and says, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to their Lord, their God, to make ready a people for the Lord prepared. Zechariah has taken this all in, and he asks the question. He says, how shall I know this? For I'm an old man, and my wife's also getting up there, right? She's also advanced in years. The angel told Zechariah, you're going to have a son. Remember that pain point that they've carried with them throughout their entire life, that pain point? The angel says, hey, you're going to have a son. And I can only imagine Zechariah like, really now? Like, you're choosing now as the time to tell me this? You're choosing now as the time to give me a son? Why couldn't this have happened 40 years ago when we were young and we could have handled a kid, when we could have avoided all of that embarrassment in our life, when we could have avoided all of the family Christmases where we're just like, yeah, still no kids, I feel like he had kind of even got to the point of acceptance. I feel like Zechariah is kind of confused, even as the angel set the plan of motion, right? Set this plan for the Messiah into motion, that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were known, and they were known for their personal holiness. It was a real big pain point. Have you ever had a double obstacle in your way? Not just one obstacle in front of you, but like multiple obstacles, right? I mean, I feel like in this scene, Zechariah is just like, the irony here, right? I'm old now. I can't do this. He probably felt the famous words of the poet Alanis Morissette. It's like rain. No? On a wedding day, it's a free ride. Yeah, when you already paid. It's the good advice that you just didn't take. I mean, who would have thought? Who would have figured that this is what would have been happening right now? It's like rain on a wedding day. They were looking for a tomb, and God was looking for a womb, and they're like, these things don't jive, right? Like, you're picking the wrong people. Why couldn't this have happened 40 years ago? Have you ever wrestled with God on some of these questions? Things just didn't go as planned. The timing was all wrong. Why, God? Why me? Why now? Why do I have to go through this? Why is this happening to me? I would have been happy to do this 6 years ago, 2 years ago, 2 months ago. Why didn't you show up then? Here we have this common, ordinary garden variety priest who is dealing with a personal and public pain. And for a long time, he waited. He finally gets visited by an angel from the presence of the Lord to tell him that not only the Messiah is coming, Not only the Messiah is coming, but your son, which you're going to have, is going to be the press agent, is going to be the person that's announcing the Messiah. And it's all going to happen in your lifetime. What a joy, what an opportunity that he just has to be conflicted over. And so he has questions, some doubting questions, and he asks them. And in verse 20, the angel looks at him and says, "But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you will be silent and unable to speak until the child is born." And in verse 22, when he finally came out of the tent, when he finally came out of the holy place, he couldn't speak. They realized because of his gestures and his silence that he must have seen a vision in the sanctuary. Now, that word silent and couldn't speak is also the same word for deaf and mute, right? So some scholars believe that it wasn't just that he couldn't talk, but because he could have just written things down all the time and heard, they think he really had a hard time of hearing as well. And so the last thing that this holy man, this holy priest gets to experience is the news of a lifetime. And the first time that he gets to share it with somebody, he can't. He missed out on this privilege to be able to share. He's the only one on earth that knows what's going on at this point. And he can't share it. And I can only imagine that as he's sitting there, unable to communicate, unable to take in new information, his reopening of wounds just kind of continues. You ever had a wound that's reopened? Something that you thought was dead and buried? Something that you had accepted or forgotten about? And it was reopened? Wounds are the consistent damage that we experience throughout our life, and it can be emotional, and it can be physical, and it can be spiritual. These wounds that just continually keep coming up. And virtually all of us have some kind of wound that we're trying to heal from. And it becomes really, really difficult for us to finally accept those wounds in our life. And if you've ever experienced one of them, they hurt. There's real pain there. Much less when it's so public. Something that you used to be or used to do, or something that everybody already knows. When you go through those points of personal pain in your life, how do you respond? How do you respond when you go through those? Are you proud of who you are in those moments? I think oftentimes we get really frustrated with who we become in those moments. But if we're going to understand this Christmas story, if we're going to see this Christmas story from the perspective of Zechariah, we need to understand something. That God's power works in the midst of our personal pain. God could choose to work around us, right? God could choose to work around it, but he chooses to work through it. See, remember, I want you to remember that I serve a God whose power isn't limited by my personal pain or my problems. My deficiencies are not enough to stop my God. My deficiencies aren't strong enough to hold back his power. And while he could choose to work around them, or work around somebody else, or find a womb that he could be using, got attacked by a fly right there. While he could choose to go around us, he chooses to use our pain points, our public pain points for his glory. See, when God shows up in Zechariah's life, Zechariah believes that he has a deficiency in completing the task that God offers him. And that deficiency disqualifies him from being used by God and according to his plan. So whatever we think our deficiency might be, there's a real possibility that God is able to use, not in spite of, but use that deficiency within us. God has the power to work through us despite what we believe our problem is. Now listen, I love this next passage, okay? Are you ready? I absolutely love it because Zechariah had a decision to make. He had a choice to make. He left. He came out. He couldn't speak. He couldn't communicate. They just had to figure out, okay, what's going on? I think something happened, right? Think probably something happened, but he couldn't finish his priestly duties there. And so in verse 23, it says, when Zechariah's week of service in the temple was over, he returned home. And soon afterward, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant. And then he went into seclusion for 5 months. Now listen, I don't want to be too weird here, but Zechariah had a choice, and he chose to do, this wasn't the Immaculate Conception, okay? This wasn't the Immaculate Conception. That's later on. We'll talk about that next week with Mary. Zechariah had a choice, and he came home and got to work. He understood what God said, and he still had a task to perform, and he still was able to move, and he still was able to believe that God was doing something. He could have just sat there and waited. So Zechariah is there in seclusion for 9 months. His wife is pregnant. She's rejoicing. Stuff goes on. She goes on a trip. She goes to visit her cousin Mary. And for at least 9 months, Zechariah had the decision to make about his personal pain. Do I hang on to it? Or do I focus on the promise that God has? Do I hang on to it? Do I hold on to it? Or do I say, you know what? I'm just going to focus on the last thing that I heard. Focus on the last thing that I saw. How do I engage with the promise that God has given us? He chose to use that time that he had to allow God to change his perspective. To allow God to change his perspective. And while God was working while he was waiting. I know we don't like to hear that. I know I don't like to hear that. But in our patience, in our waiting, God is still working. Elizabeth is pregnant with a son. There's a party going on, and we're going to fast forward to verse 59 if you're following along in Luke chapter 1. Fast forwarding, she's pregnant, she gives birth. They're having a party with the family, and they're like, hey, let's name the kid Zechariah. Let's name the kid after his father, who you didn't think he was going to be a father. He had accepted the fact. He was ready looking for a tomb. Like this was not something that was in the cards. Let's honor his father by giving him his name. And then in verse 62, so they used gestures to ask the baby's father what he wanted his name to be. And he motioned for a writing tablet, and to everyone's surprise, he wrote, his name is John. Instantly, Zechariah could speak again, and he began praising God. Instantly, he started to speak again. Once he was able, not just once he was born, but once his actions were put into place, and he said, I'm believing here. I've chosen to live into this promise right here. God's changed my perspective. This boy's name is John. I got nothing to do with it. I'm going to surrender all of that personal pain over, and I'm going to say this might not even be my son because God named him John. I'm going to name him John. He was still working God was still working while he was waiting. And it says he immediately began praising God. Now I think that point is very, very intentional. He immediately began praising God. Do you remember what happened whenever he entered God's presence? He entered the holy place. They had the incense. He burned it, offered up the prayers, right? And when he came out, he had one more thing to do. Does anyone remember? He couldn't finish his priestly duties. He never got to offer the blessing. He never got to offer the blessing. Now, this blessing was a blessing that priests every single day would come out and offer the people. It was called the Aaronic blessing, the blessing of Aaron. And in Numbers, this blessing goes all the way back to Numbers. And in Numbers chapter 6, verses 22, it says, the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. 9, 10 months had passed, and Zechariah was unable to communicate. He was unable to finish his job, the priestly role that he had and he so enjoyed. He was unable to come back and bless the people with those words that had been repeated each and every single day for centuries. And instead, the very second that this man could speak again, the praises of God were on his lips. The praises of God were on his lips. He had chosen to focus on the promises. He had asked God, God, just change my perspective. Forgive my doubt. Change my perspective. And the 4 verses that I read in this 11-verse prophecy from Zechariah are this: Blessed be the Lord of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people. He blessed them. And he has raised up a horn of salvation for those of us in the house of David, his servant. He has kept them. Because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break on us. God, your face is about to shine on us. You've told me what you're doing. You're setting your plan in motion. Your face is about to make it shine upon us. And to give those in darkness and in the shadow of death a guide, and guide us to the path of peace. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you, be gracious to you, and give you peace. Zechariah stayed rooted in God's promises and gained a perspective beyond his personal pain. I want you to remember what line Elizabeth came from? She was from the priestly line, but you could directly trace her ancestry back to who? Aaron. What blessing was this that he gave? The blessing that was given to Aaron. God had chosen to use them as a specific people to bless the world, to bring his blessing to the world. And because of this opportunity that he had, in the midst of his personal pain, in the midst of his public problems, God had chosen him. He said, I'm going to work through your deficiencies. Don't you worry about that. I want you to see things from a perspective that maybe you're unfamiliar with. I want you to look at something else, that my power is not limited by your problems, that my power isn't limited by your old age or by your barrenness or by the things that other people judge you by. That's not how my power works. I serve a God, and Zechariah served a God, and he said, you know what? I'm going to focus on your promises. In the middle of my personal pain, as I'm going through things that I don't want to go through, as I'm sitting there in solitude and silence, unable to communicate the best news I've ever heard, unable to take in new information, I'm going to choose to focus on your promise, not my problems, not my pain. It's a beautiful story to set up Christmas. This is the setup, people. This is we haven't even got to, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree. But this is that last bit. This is every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. This makes the story have so much more. The first thing, as Zechariah's pain is finally lifted on his lips, is praise. A blessing for his people. A prophecy for what's coming. And today, as we sit here and as we gather and as we come into this room and as there's first-time visitors with us and as there's people who have been here for a long time, as there are people who have plans as you leave here and you got to go to 35 parties this Christmas, and as you've got to go to this, that, or the other, we're all dealing with those pain points in our life. What would that look like if, just like Zechariah, instead of focusing on our pain, we focused on his promise? We focus on the promise of God being with us. And just like Zechariah's son made way for him, make the path straight for the Messiah to be engaged in some people's life, in the people that are surrounding us. So today, here's what I'm going to ask as we dismiss, as we leave. I'm going to go ahead and invite you guys to stand. We have an amazing prayer team that's going to go ahead and come up. I want us to leave here today with a blessing. Something exciting that we get to leave with, and it's the same Aaron promise. The promise that God gave Moses and told Moses to give to Aaron and told Aaron to give to his people. And as you leave here today, I want you to go holding on, not to the pain that you have, Not to the personal problems that you have, not to your deficiencies, but knowing that I serve a God and you can serve a God who the deficiencies that we have in our life, the problems that we have, do not matter. God is willing and able and more powerful to work through those problems if we're able to focus on his promises, or if we're able to focus on the blessings that he's bestowed upon us. And so today, here's what I'm going to ask. Just like my kids, when I hold up a present on Christmas Day, they're like, "That's mine, I know it." And they just want that present. Here's what I'm going to ask of you. I want you to just receive a blessing today. And I'm just going to ask you to stand with your hands like this. Just, God, give me a blessing today. And this blessing is going to be the same blessing that has been given for centuries to God's people. That Emmanuel, God with us, is making us a part of and has invited us into. And the blessing is simply this. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. Make his face shine upon you. Turn his face towards you and give you peace. Peace beyond your problems. Peace beyond our pain.